Hi everybody, it's me, Katie, and welcome back to my channel where it is all Revolutionary War all the time. And today, as you can see, I'm standing out in front of this very lovely, kind of typical style 18th century New England home. And it is a beautiful day in April. The trees are budding, the grasses are growing, and it is just the epitome of peacefulness, right? But what if I told you that on April 19th, 1775, more Americans died here, inside this very house, and on this property than anywhere else on what would become the first day of the American Revolution? Everything I've told you is true. Welcome to the Jason Russell House. Jason Russell built this house in 1740, and as you can see, it is situated on the corner of a very busy street. And this is a busy street nowadays, and it was in 1775 as well. This is modern day Massachusetts Avenue, aka Mass Ave. But in 1775, it was known as the Old Concord Road or the Bay Road. And it is down this street that the British retreated from Lexington and Concord on April 19th. We know that late on the night of April 18th, the British left Boston on an ill-fated expedition to seize military supplies at Concord. They ran into the Lexington Company of Militia under Captain John Parker at Lexington. Shots were famously fired, and 8 Americans were killed on Lexington Green, and several more were wounded. As many as 9 or 10 more men were wounded. But the British column kept moving west out to Concord, where there was another engagement at the Old North Bridge, where 2 more Americans were killed. The British did manage to burn some military supplies, but they ultimately withdrew from Concord and began their retreat back through the countryside, trying to get to the relative safety of Boston. However, alarm riders had been dispatched from Boston overnight, and the entire Massachusetts countryside had been alerted that the regulars were out. And in response to this news, militia companies from towns near and far mustered and began to march to this area in order to respond. As they all arrived and kind of converged on this area, they took various positions along this battle road through modern day Arlington, which in 1775 was commonly known as Menotomy. And so the British rear flank wasn't just being attacked, the entire British column was being attacked, as well as more and more militiamen converged on this area and positioned themselves along this battle road through Menotomy. So as militiamen converged upon this area, many of them found positions here on Jason Russell's property. And a lot of these men were from Essex County, Massachusetts, which is that kind of North Shore coastal area of Massachusetts. Towns in Essex County had heard of the Lexington alarm at about 9 a.m. and militia companies set out and made it a distance of about 16 or 18 miles in about 4 to 4.5 hours. So they set an absolutely scorching pace and arrived here in Menotomy, where several members of those companies took positions here on Jason Russell's land. Jason Russell himself, during this time, had worked to secure his family at a homestead away from the battle. Many people up and down the battle road were scattering into the woods. A lot of women managing many children were seeking spots of safety away from the battle. And at this time, Jason Russell lived here with his wife, Elizabeth, who was 54, his daughter, Elizabeth, who was 19, his son, Noah, who was 12, and possibly an enslaved woman named Kate. After he helped them find safety, he returned here to his house, probably to look after his property and maybe to participate in the battle itself. Upon his return, militiamen were crouching behind his walls, hiding behind trees. Some of them, possibly with Jason Russell, were constructing simple breastworks out of shingles or wood in the yard, anything that they could find that would help them find cover where they could fire at the British column as it approached along the side of Jason Russell's house. As the British column approached, one of the Essex County men here on this property, Captain Israel Hutchinson from Danvers, kind of just got out a few words of warning. He was a seasoned soldier, had served in the French and Indian Wars, and he must have had a sense of what was happening or what was about to happen. As the British column approached, they sent out flanking parties. And the job of the flanking parties was to kind of traverse the fields and the woods along the battle road, kind of running parallel to it. And these light infantry troops, who were very agile, quick on their feet, would seek out any militia that were positioned along the battle road and clear them out with musket or bayonet. And doing so would allow the main column to pass safely through, unmolested by militia along the side of the road. However, what Captain Hutchinson must have picked up on about this position is that the militiamen had placed themselves in between the retreating main column and the path of the flanking parties. And so very suddenly, Captain Hutchinson just barely was able to speak. He said something to the effect of, "We need to move. We're going to get caught by the flanking parties. This position isn't good." When suddenly the flanking party was upon them, and the militia were trapped in between the main column and the flanking party, caught out in the open in the crossfire. In a desperate bid to find shelter, many of the men bolted into Jason Russell's house. Jason Russell himself, however, was slowed by his lame leg and was probably the last man to attempt to enter the house. He was shot down on his doorstep and repeatedly bayoneted by the British troops who rushed in to the house in pursuit of the American militia. As militiamen raced into Jason Russell's house for safety, several of them entered the kitchen. And this is one of the kitchen windows right here. Amongst those men who raced into the kitchen was Daniel Townsend of Lynn and Timothy Monroe of Lynn. And both of those men, in an attempt to escape the bayonet-wielding British troops who had pursued them into the house, both men jumped out this very window. Timothy Monroe was shot and wounded, and his clothing was riddled with bullet holes, but he managed to make a mad dash for his life, and he survived. Daniel Townsend did not. He was shot and killed by the troops as he jumped out, and he may have sustained some wounds from crashing through the panes of glass. He was 36 years old and married to 31-year-old Zervia Townsend. And a really sad footnote to this story is that she only lived for another 6 months after this. She died in October of 1775, leaving her and Daniel's 10-year-old son, John, an orphan. Other militiamen also raced into the kitchen, and several of them flung open the cellar door, and they fled into the cellar of this house. And I think kind of at first glance, I know myself, I think that a cellar probably sounds like a really bad place to hide, because when you think of a cellar, you think of being trapped and no egress. And was there a bulkhead back then? But what ended up happening is that the cellar became the only sanctuary that Jason Russell's house could offer. The Essex County men that hid in the cellar pointed their muskets up the stairs. And when one British soldier started to descend the stairs, they shot him. And they did the same to any other soldier that attempted to follow, to any British soldier that attempted to go down those stairs and pursue them. They trained their guns upwards and they shot. The entryway to the cellar is still marked with the bullet holes that the Americans shot upward from the basement. And this act saved their life. The British gave up on trying to pursue the men in the cellar. They ransacked the house and then left. The house grew quiet again. Every other militiaman who sought refuge in this house was killed, except the men in the cellar. There are still bullet holes in the cellar entryway from where the men in the cellar trained their guns upward and fired at the British soldiers. And those holes in the wood kind of bear testimony to those life and death moments that unfolded here in this house on April 19th. And in fact, this whole house is scarred with other bullet holes from that fateful day. The whole house is riddled with them. Later that day, Elizabeth Russell does return here to her house, and she finds her husband dead along with the other men that were killed in her house. They were all laid out on the kitchen floor, the blood from their wounds pooling around them. And she said that the blood in the room was almost ankle deep. During the next day, the bodies were collected and put on a cart and transported here to the Arlington Burying Ground, which was established in 1724. And it's just a matter of a couple blocks from Jason Russell's house. And Jason Russell is buried here along with 11 other men who also lost their lives on April 19th. 9 militiamen from various towns that responded to the Lexington alarm, and also 2 civilians from Menotomy. This is the original slate marker to this mass grave. But not all of the men who were killed in Jason Russell's house or on his property are buried here. Several of the men's bodies made it back to Essex County, to Danvers in particular. 7 men from Danvers were killed at Jason Russell's house. Danvers lost the second most number of men on April 19th. Only Lexington lost more. And we'll be doing a whole video focusing on those Danvers men and visiting their final resting place up in Essex County. But now I'll show you a close-up of this gravestone and read you the epitaph. I think you'll find it very striking. Mr. Jason Russell was barbarously murdered in his own house by Gage's bloody troops on the 19th of April, 1775, at the age of 59. His body is quietly resting in this grave with 11 of our friends who, in like manner, with many others, were cruelly slain on that fatal day. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Out of the 49 Americans that were killed on April 19th, 1775, 25 of them were killed here in Menotomy. And of those, fully 12 were killed in Jason Russell's house or on his property. The Jason Russell House is a museum. It's open to the public. It is owned and operated by the Arlington Historical Society. So if you're planning a visit to Boston or to Lexington and Concord, it is well worth your time to pay a visit here. Once you are inside this building and you see the musket ball holes still in the walls and in the risers of the staircases, you will never forget it. I'll post some information in the description box below about the Arlington Historical Society, and you'll just want to be sure that you check their opening hours and days before you visit. I also did another video on the mass grave in Menotomy where Jason Russell is buried with some other militiamen and civilians in Menotomy who were killed here on April 19th, and I will link that to this video. Thank you all so much for sharing the journey with me, and I hope to see you on the next video.